Thank you, Speaker Brother. Heard my colleagues across the aisle discussing issue of Special Counsel Mueller, and since there's one of two possibilities about some of the things they said regarding Republicans, and especially on the committee, either Mr. Cohen's memory is terrible or he's falsely, intentionally misrepresenting things. So I'm not saying that's the case. I'm saying it's one or the other, and I will get to that momentarily. This hearing we had this week in Judiciary with Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, deeply, deeply troubling to those who want the Department of Justice to be about justice. Those who want to see the FBI be that great arbiter, that great entity that will assure that justice is done. We need an entity like that. The ATF, their reputation was sorely soiled back during the attack by the ATF on Waco at the facility where some folks that had been sucked into basically a cult. It didn't have to happen, and as we found out, local law enforcement said we knew that Dave Koresh went to Sam's wholesale spot right there in Belmead I think they said Tuesday, and if the ATF had told us they wanted to arrest him, we could have helped them arrange to pick him up as he walked out of Sam's with grocery sacks in his arms, and there would have been no incident. No lives would have been lost, no children burned up in a fire, no people killed so unnecessarily. But the ATF apparently wanted to make a point and wanted to have a big show, and actually there were constitutional issues there. I read in the paper that a gentleman that served with me at Fort Benning, Georgia, during my time in the Army, had advised the post commander out at Fort Bliss that he should not allow the U.S. Army tanks or equipment to be used in violation of the Posse Comitatus unless he had a direct order from the president himself. And as we found out after the fact, the president made clear that, oh, that was Reno's deal. You have to talk to her about that. So clearly he did not order U.S. military to use equipment and allow their equipment to be used against civilian American citizens. So there were all kinds of terrible things that came out, and it really made the ATF look bad. And I was a fan of the ATF, the federal ATF. They knew them to have done some great things, and I had some very dear friends, and still do have some very dear, great friends that are in the ATF. But the point is, such horrendous judgment in the ATF setting up what they knew or should have known would probably result in losses of lives, including severe injuries to ATF themselves. I don't think they lost anybody, but they certainly were severely wounded and treated there in Waco. But that kind of outrageous judgment that puts political and news interest ahead of just doing the job and seeing justice done ends up being such a terrible blot on the reputation of any entity that it's hard to work back from that. I still hear people that refer to that incident about it nearly 25 years ago. And still it is such a blot on the ATF that it's hard for people to consider the ATF without thinking how terribly just inappropriate the ATF acted at times, and caused people to wonder, is that the general rule or was that an exception? And people, after some other episodes, began to think it's the rule with the ATF. Some clamored, let's get rid of it. What has gone on now is currently going on now with the Deputy Attorney General taking all three positions, that he sees no evil, he hears no evil. He doesn't know of any evil going on. He thinks everything, the poet said, God's in his heaven and all's right with the world. I believe the author had a little girl saying that. But it's not right with the world. It's terribly wrong. And America and the world sit in a position where potentially Western civilization, where the most incredible, amazing strides in healthcare, in energy, in all kinds of areas of life on this earth have been made better exponentially. And the United States of America is at the very heart of those great developments. A majority in the United States throughout our history would always say we call those blessings from God. Now, maybe it is, maybe it isn't a majority, but we are ever getting closer to a position where this grand experiment in self-judgment is potentially on the verge of being lost. History is not being taught as zealously as it once was. Places like Hillsdale College or Liberty or Regents, there are some places where it is being taught. I had fantastic history teachers, which is what I majored in at Texas A&M, because I knew I was going to do 4 years in the Army at least, and if we were at war when my 4 years were up, I would have continued to serve. But our students don't know history anymore. Why? Because President Carter decided that the federal government intervention into education, even though it's not an enumerated power under the Constitution and is therefore a power that is reserved to the states and the people and not the federal government, well, we've been acting extra constitutionally. That means outside the Constitution for quite some time, going back to the late 70s under President Carter. And our students have suffered as a result, and they don't know history. And someone had advised me that even though history is not an important part of the federally mandated test, there are things that in different subjects are mandated by the federal government. Here is an element that students should know about the subject. And I was advised that the one area that the federal mandated test, the only area historically that students were required to know, is that when the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs, one on Hiroshima and one on Nagasaki, it raised serious moral questions, or it raised serious questions about the United States morality. which is absolutely fictitious unless the issue of the authors requiring such a thing did not allow them to know the truth. The truth being that Truman was advised that because the Emperor of Japan had ordered the Japanese people to fight for their homes to the death, then the Allied forces would have to land in Japan. They would have had to move across the country, and it was considered a very fair and possibly quite conservative estimate that there could be 10 million people lose their lives if Allied forces had to land and were fighting the Japanese people home to home to home. So the morality of the issue is, would we morally be better off in this absolute war that the Japanese started against the United States? Would we be better off losing the horrible tragedy of 300,000 or so lives, or would we be better off having 5 or so million Japanese people killed and 5 or so million Allied forces being lost? And the morally correct decision that a Democrat, a man that apparently really wrestled with the issue from a moral standpoint, he decided to put the American bombers at risk, those flying the planes and taking the atomic bombs, and to put 200,000-300,000 or so people at risk in an effort to avoid losing 5 million or so Japanese and an equal number or more of the Allied forces. I think he made the correct moral decision. So that doesn't raise moral issues about the United States. It raises ignorance issues about the federally mandated test. We would be so much better off if we got back to allowing local school boards to decide and states to decide, as they had been for many decades, deciding what their students should learn. That was the beauty of a federalist situation where states would have so much power. But as is often the case, when the federal government takes over an area like education, then it gets worse. And I was on the board of directors of the Texas A&M Former Student Association, and I can recall the president advising us that the SAT, official SAT, had to change the scoring system for the SAT because students across the board were doing so much worse than they did when classes around my era in the 70s had done. That we had done overall so much better than the students that came through after the federal government took over education. And so I don't know if it was accurate, but I had educators back at the time say there's a formula, so it's hard to say, but say if you scored, say 1,400 or 1,600 on the SAT in the 70s, then under the new scoring system, it would probably be scored closer to 1,600, 15 to 1,600, maybe a couple hundred points that they had to add to the system because after we had a federal Department of Education, then students started doing worse. And so to keep it from looking like the Department of Education here in Washington made education as poor as it helped to do, we had to raise the SAT scores basically on an arbitrary basis. We know that the students coming through in the 80s, 90s, and then this new millennium, they have the potential to do better than we ever did. But because the federal government got involved, I don't think it's just a great irony that when the federal government took over education under President Carter, that, wow, ironically, isn't it amazing, at the same time students were doing worse and worse. So that's what often happens when the federal government get involved, and we saw that with Waco. If they had gotten the help of the local law enforcement, there would have been no loss of lives in all reality. But the ATF was going to bust in and make a big show out of it, and it cost an awful lot of lives. Well, you'd like to think that when the FBI comes in, you don't have to worry. They're going to do the right thing. And I know so many incredible, outstanding FBI agents. But for Mr. Cohen to continue to say, even after he's been advised and reminded that I have been raising Cain about Robert Mueller for over a decade, I guess. He came in, sworn in January of 2007, as I understand it. And initially, when I questioned Robert Mueller, his FBI director, when I first got to Congress, I was carrying that image of the great FBI, the image that so many of the agents still carry, thousands of them still carry, but with more and more difficulty because of the cesspools that have developed here in Washington and the way in which it has been used, as we saw with the IRS during the Obama administration, weaponized and used as a political instrument. Now, how do we know that? Well, we didn't know near as much as we continue to find out, but Robert Mueller ran off thousands of years of experience, and I contend it was because he wanted nothing but yes people. He didn't want the experienced people around the country that might try to point out to the director when he made one of his many mistakes as FBI director, or chose software programs, chose law enforcement programs that created problems because they had more experience than he did. He did not really want people around the country to have more experience than he did because they might question something that he ordered inappropriately. And he just wanted people to salute him, salute the flag, figuratively speaking, and drive forward. And that means when Mueller wanted somebody to bust down the door in the middle of the night, even though there was no threat of the individual fleeing, no threat of the individual hiding evidence, it's done, as we are now seeing the Mueller special counsel group, team, SWAT unit, unofficial SWAT, of course, but we're seeing them use these type of tactics. Now, I don't really know Paul Manafort. He doesn't seem like a fellow that I would enjoy getting along with. Nonetheless, it certainly appeared that he was very materially mistreated because Mueller wanted to make sure he got his point. They knocked down the door, or at least went in the middle of the night, however they got in. And, we've heard this before. This heavy-handed federal government. And there was no reason for that other than bullying, mean federal agents at the top wanting to bully people around. We saw that kind of conduct with Mike Flynn as he was set up. He had been, as part of the transition team, talking to people at the FBI about different issues. And now we know Strzok was part of that, this man that absolutely loathed the president-elect Trump. He loathed everything about Trump and those he was going to be bringing into office. We didn't know how Republicans supporting him until we got more information. But these kind of things are things that Robert Mueller should have known. He should have known the Department of Justice's reputation and hope for being considered righteous was all riding on him and what he did. And yet he rode in with his black hat, figuratively, for those in the mainstream media that don't understand those type of references. And he began to overreach. And we heard from the guy that appointed Mueller yesterday, Rod Rosenstein, that, really, to have a special counsel, you have to believe, basically that a crime was committed. So it would seem to reason that Mueller was appointed to investigate something that they had reason to believe possibly a crime had been committed. And yet, because of whether it's incompetence or zeal wanting Mueller to go on a witch hunt, to just keep searching till you find something, even if it's a poor guy like Scooter Libby that's devoted his life to helping his country, we need somebody's scalp. And it doesn't look like that Donald J. Trump was colluding with the Russians. So we got to have somebody's scalp. Let's intimidate some people. Let's, bully our way into homes in the middle of the night. Let's do whatever we got to do, and maybe we'll scare somebody into admitting something. Like many are saying, Michael Flynn didn't lie. To be a lie, you have to have intent to deceive. But whether right or wrong about that, word is he was bankrupted by an overzealous bully. I mean, all my friends on the left talking about bullying. I was small for my age, and in my class, I was bullied, had black eye, bloody nose, had a fifth grade teacher after a big bully took my football, and, I tried to get it back, ended up bloody nose, black eye. Our teacher loved the bully back then and pulled me in front of the class while I was trying to get my nose to stop bleeding and told the class, this is what happens when little boys try to play with the big boys. But I know something about being bullied. And I recognize it in a government group when I see it. And the Mueller team has been bullies, but that's what Mueller wanted. Why do you think he went and hired Wiseman, who destroyed thousands and thousands of employees' lives that worked for Arthur Anderson in a joust at windmills that cost these people their livelihoods, caused more pain and suffering than imaginable, for what the Supreme Court said 9-0, you're a fool. This was not a crime. You made this up. And that's who Mueller wanted on his team. This is the same Robert Mueller, as I've been pointing out for years, that has been grossly unfair in running off the thousands of years of experience that he did so he could have great people, wonderful people, but new, and they not only were new and young, but he was eliminating the older folks that had the experience that could bring them along, because Mueller wanted them created in his image and get rid of all the wisdom of the ages that could be found throughout the FBI before he took over. And I'm sure there are a bunch of people that needed to go, but you don't destroy an entire entity like the Federal Bureau of Investigation just because you want a bunch of yes men, and that's what Bob Mueller did. That man should never have been anywhere close to being a special counsel. He couldn't stand Trump. And as the Washingtonian magazine was glorifying James Comey, I believe it was 2013 issue, where they said basically, in essence, if the world were burning down, you know, James Comey knew that the one person that would be standing there with him would be Bob Mueller. And Comey is the very guy that admitted leaking evidence or leaking information out in order to try to get a special counsel appointed. And as I covered with Mr. Rosenstein yesterday, this is part of an FBI typical employment agreement. That all information, everybody is supposed to sign this thing, swear to it. All information acquired by me in connection with my official duties with the FBI and all official material to which I have access remain the property of the United States of America. I will surrender upon demand by the FBI or upon the separation from the FBI all materials containing FBI information in my possession. So if a man like Comey goes to a meeting in his official capacity of FBI director with the President of the United States, and he comes out of there and he types up a memo, even though it appears it was a pretty, well, less than unbiased memo, trying to make President Trump look bad. So he commemorates it with a memo. Well, that memo, as I discussed with Mr. Rosenstein yesterday, that is probably government property. That's government information, government property. And the question is, did he commit a crime when he leaked that information? And there's a decent chance yes. So where is the FBI in its investigation of James Comey's potential crime? And when you look at the record and you go back, oh, now we know from that one incident, this is the person to whom he leaked, and then that got to the New York Times. Oh, well, here's another meeting where he was the principal character there, the most likely person to have leaked, and, well, lo and behold, his same conduit for leaking information that he's admitted to ends up being in place in this story. There may be at least 6 other places where he has leaked information, and some of them will be crimes. But because the special counsel was all about trying to strip the winner of a presidential election, we're not going after Comey. We're not going after any of these other people. They're trying to find something, as we now know from the text messages of FBI agent Strzok. They wanted an insurance policy so that in case Trump won, they could still get rid of him. Of course, Strzok believed that no one in this country should vote, not a single person, not even Donald Trump's family should vote for him. It ought to be 100 million to 0. But, Mr. Speaker, it is so clear that in my days of trying cases in federal court, state court, where you're asking questions of a jury panel to see who would be fair enough to sit on a jury, we can see that these people that were working and have been, and some still are, for the FBI, for the Department of Justice, they have no business getting close to this investigation unless they are a target of investigation. This Andrew Weissman should never have been a part of the special counsel team. Peter Strzok, I mean, this is only some of the text message he sent, but he says, he asked me who I'd vote for, guessed Kasich. It goes on. God, Trump is loathsome human, yet he many win. Good for Hillary. It is. Would he be a worse president than Cruz? Trump? Yes, I think so. And this, of course, is an exchange between Peter Strzok, P.S. in this, and his mistress, Lisa Page, who's also working for the FBI. I mean, these people have done irreparable damage to the FBI, but worse than that, they have made a mockery of justice in the United States. And what really gets me, I know how upset I was in the Bush administration when I saw somebody do wrong. I didn't care if he was appointed by a Republican or Democrat. I didn't care that President Bush had appointed a man or a woman to a position. What I cared about was them being righteous and doing the right thing. And now, where is my Democrat friend who will stand up and say, this isn't right? We know Alan Dershowitz, great Democrat, brilliant intellect. He's done it. But where are people across the aisle that would do what I did during the Bush presidency, pick up the phone and say, this is an outrage. What has happened under this Attorney General should never have happened. He's got to go. Where is the Democrat that has a sense of moral outrage when the justice system is just shaken to its core by people that want to take out a president because they didn't support him, they didn't want him to be there, they didn't think any American should vote for him, and they're destroying a sense of justice and our justice system. It's time for Americans to wake up. It's time to clean house, get rid of Mueller, get some fair people in there to investigate. And with that,